But increasingly interested in the energy sector. And I come to this via thinking about the politics and political economy of climate change. And so what I'd like to do in my intervention today, and there is a sort of concept note. I started with the ambition of a paper, it's become a concept note, but there are copies of it available that I can circulate to anyone that's interested in what I have to say. But basically what I want to try and draw on and summarise are contributions from three different areas. One is political economy work in general. Another is political economy of development. So obviously the discussion we've had so far today has been fairly UK-centric, fairly Euro-centric. I want to try and dig in a bit to debates and literatures from perhaps other parts of the world, which I think might have a bearing on some of the questions that we're considering today. And then finally on global governance, so I'm going even more into the sort of landscape, to use that sort of language that comes from the multi-level perspective. And what these have to say about the sorts of questions that we're dealing with today. And I think they're useful for getting a handle on key governance questions, which I take to be who governs and who does not. So the questions of inclusion, exclusion, participation that we've been touching on a little bit. The questions of how they govern, through what means, through market, through public-private partnerships, what sort of practices, modalities, technologies of governance. Questions around what is to be governed and what's not. So where does the regulatory gaze fall, if you like, but what issues are left in the shade? So this might come back a bit to some of the things that Frank touched upon in terms of structural power or non-decision making, etc. And then the question of on whose behalf, which I take to be a sort of primary political economy question, who wins and who loses from prevailing governance arrangements around energy. So it's questions of energy justice in lots of ways. And so the way the starting point is, the point that Florian and Adrian Smith, James Meadowcroft and others have made about the need to deepen our analysis of the politics and political economy of transitions and transformation. To try and understand a bit about the why questions that Caroline started with, but also the how questions, how change comes about, looking at that historically as well as in the contemporary context, and trying to get an appreciation of the landscape of power upon which we're hoping and expecting maybe that some of these transitions will play out. And so using political economy analysis to understand the incumbent regime, but also where there may be spaces of transformation, to come back to the title. So let me start with some thoughts on the role of the state, because we keep going back to is it government or governance? Where's the role of the state in this? And I guess, it's my sense at least, that in any notion of a transition, we're talking about the state as an enabler, as a facilitator of conditions for low-carbon transitions. People talk a lot about the convening power of the state, the legitimacy it has to bring together business, labour, other concerned actors, and I think all of those things are important. There's clearly questions about state capacity. Some states have more or less capacity and more or less willingness to even engage in transition projects of one sort or another, and I think we need to get a handle on how and why that is. And again, the paper that the IGov people circulated I thought was really useful in starting to get a handle on how different models of state or different models of political economy, i.e. relationships between states and markets, produce very different types of transitions and outcomes, and how likewise policy-making processes do the same thing. So whether we're talking about more managed and state-led or more corporatist, more deliberative or more entrepreneurial types of state, might make a big difference to who the key actors are, what sorts of transitions might be possible. And I think we need to think more about those. Likewise, the emphasis in that paper from Matthew and Caroline, etc., on varieties of capitalism, I thought was useful in giving us a handle on some of those things, the different ideologies, effectively, about the role of the state in managing key parts of the economy, energy, industry, transport, etc. And I think getting a handle on those issues is important for what might be possible. Who sets the terms of transition? I mean, so that's partly some of the questions or some of the discussion we've had already about what are we transitioning towards? What's the end point? Is there an end point? When would we know when we've reached that end point? And how you bring on board the losers of transitions as well. I think this is something that comes through a lot now in the literature on just transitions that people may be familiar with. There are some sectors, workers within sectors, that will lose from a serious shift towards a lower carbon economy, for example. What do you do about that? What are the political deals and trade-offs that need to take place in order to make this a desirable and inclusive thing to do? So perhaps it's complex as well. So relevant work for thinking about the state, and again this is taking it way out of its European context. There's a lot of work on developmental space and policy autonomy within development studies, which is an area I've come from. And that's thinking about how much scope developing countries have to pursue their own visions about how to tackle particular issues. And I can see there that this would apply also to energy sector and transitions. In other words, do countries, because some countries more than others, will have the power to set the terms of transition in alignment with their overriding development objectives, and others won't, depending on their levels of aid dependency, the extent to which they're subject to trade rules. And that a little bit comes back to the point I was flagging earlier with Frank, that, oh my God, 5 minutes to go. So use of subsidies, infant industry, intellectual property rights, all of these things which we know are crucial to protecting niches, to stimulating innovation in one way or another, are often denied, or increasingly being denied to many poorer countries. So there's issues about the power to set the terms of transition that I think are really important. Likewise, work on the developmental state, I think, might also be very interesting here. Lots of case studies, principally focused on East Asia, about the important role of industrial policy. And the question, I guess, then is, what does the role of a developmental state look like in other contexts where the politics are more open and messy, and there's more open conflict than in some of the less democratic settings in which developmental state literatures have traditionally focused. And then there's more country-specific literatures around the state, which Lucy will talk about later, so I won't say any more about that. Things like the minerals energy complex in South Africa, which she'll be talking about. So that's one thing about the role of the state. Secondly then is the context of globalisation, which we could think about in landscape terms. And again, it picked up on the comment I made earlier about the extent to which fear of capital flight, concerns about competitiveness, enable some types of transition, enable some policy options to be kept on the agenda, but also render others increasingly impossible or politically unlikely. And again, think about debates about the carbon tax, the recent backloading proposals, and many other examples. But the globalisation story could play the other way, and this is one thing that comes up a little bit in the book I wrote with Matthew Patterson on climate capitalism, is the increasing power of global finance and how that might be important to destabilising particular regimes and enabling certain forms of decarbonisation. And I'm interested there in the way in which carbon trading disclosure schemes, other ways of trying to capitalise on the new lower carbon economy, might be attractive to very powerful fractions of capital, or to finance capital in particular, and whether that might be one way you start to construct a coalition of the willing and the willing from decarbonisation. Because I guess ultimately that's how I read political economy and analysis of power, is in terms of its ability to help us understand what coalitions, political coalitions, are required to drive this project forward, how to unseat and destabilise the incumbents and drive forward various niche innovations. And if you think about that historically, Carlota Perez's work on the role of finance in transitions, I think, is useful in showing how the importance of finance in allowing innovation, bubbles, etc., which then need to be managed and regulated to make them productive and effective. Final point then is on global governance, and I think this is one area that's been a little bit neglected, it seems to me. I was part of a project some years ago led by Anne Florini at the National University of Singapore to write global governance of energy, and several of us were asked to write case studies on particular aspects of this. But it strikes me in these debates about multi-level perspective and that sort of things, we could think more productively about what role global institutions might play in enabling, and in some cases of course constraining, energy transitions at national level. Because we've got very strong producer clubs. If you think about OPEC or the role of IEA, there's clubs of rich countries, G8, OECD, WTO, etc. But there's increasing emphasis on global level energy initiatives, sustainable energy for all, the UN energy work, more and more transnational energy governance, public-private partnerships, REAP, REN 21, numerous other things like this. But it's currently, it seems to me, very weak and very incoherent, quite fragmented. It's not sending strong signals about the direction of change, but potentially it could do. And again, how to theorise that. I come from international relations principally as my main discipline, and there's a lot of work on regimes, but not the way we're talking about regimes today. It's regime theory, which talks about how international institutions come about, how they evolve, and what makes them more or less effective. And I think there could be insights there that might be useful for some of the sort of thinking we're doing today about, which institutions we're hoping will create this enabling environment globally that will then support transitions at the national level, and what sort of pressures would it come up against. So just finally then, on questions of transformation and strategy that feed from all of this, and as I say, I'm giving a very brief summary here, and I'm happy to circulate the longer version of my notes here. I think one thing we need to think about is the sort of south-south aspect of transitions here, as well as the north-south aspect, the role of BRIC, the basic countries, in driving particular patterns of lock-in, carbon lock-in through their investment policies, and how we deal with that. How Brazil, India, China are trying to deal with their own energy security problems and dilemmas, and in some cases it's through land grabs, commodity booms, investments of one sort or another. So there's a whole series of other spillover effects in the global economy, which I think are really important and need to be understood. And I guess I'd conclude with this thinking about the shift from transition to transformation. And a lot of people are now making that shift, it seems to me. Time's up, I know. I have a quote in here from the Heinrich Boll Foundation, a publication they have on what they call the Great Transformation, which they define as the ecological conversion of industrial societies into a climate-compatible, resource-conserving and sustainable world economic order. And they talk about the centrality of just and sustainable governance within all of that. And I'm reminded in the way in which people are using this language of Karl Polanyi's work, obviously, to go back to another political economist, who was talking about this need to re-embed markets in broader frameworks of social control. And the question for us, I guess, is whether we can see signs of that in the different experiments that we've all been looking at, and whether we can think seriously about a shift from transition to broader forms of transformation. Stop there.
Great, thanks very much. Next.